Hello and welcome to the Roadmap for Government Enterprise Performance Management webinar. My name is Tim Dexter and I will be the moderator for today's session. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat questions area. We will address the questions in the Q&A section at the end of the presentation. If we are not able to get to your question, we will reach out to you directly. Rest assured that we will address every question, so fire away. Let me introduce Aaron Howard, President of Mass Ingenuity. So without any further ado, I'll hand over the reins to Aaron Howard.
Great, thank you, Tim, much appreciated. And welcome everybody. We're going to talk about an implementation roadmap for government, specifically for enterprise performance management, which from this point forward, I'm going to abbreviate as EPM because it's much shorter. We're going to talk about a few things that provide context. We'll talk a little bit about the unique needs and challenges of state agencies and how that impacts enterprise performance. And then we'll tell some stories. It's really important to be able to say, well, what is really going on out there? So we're going to share some stories from a couple of our customers and show you some examples, and then leave time to be able to answer your questions and that kind of thing. So a lot of folks sometimes think that state agencies have the same problems as business. And while metaphorically that's true, it's not true when you get on the ground. There's several different challenges and differences. One that's particularly interesting and very, very unique is the fact that the set of stakeholders is very complex. In business, stakeholders can be well defined into a few groups, but with state agencies, there's a lot of people to please and to talk to: citizens, businesses, ledge, governors, etc. And so this adds a great complexity to how one handles performance management and how you talk about it. There's also some really unique challenges when trying to deal with the compromises between what are the actual citizen needs, what do people need, and the policies that may be driving and guiding that. So lots of very unique challenges, but we'll talk about how we can address those relative to EPM. Well, we should start by actually defining EPM a little bit. There's a lot of different definitions. But one way to think about it is it's a framework. It's a framework that helps us align what we're doing strategically, what we do in terms of operations, for example, daily management, and how we bring all that together, how we bring resource stories, projects, decision-making, and data. How do we bring all that together? Many of you have probably experienced a meeting that goes something like this. You sit down, get ready to talk about performance. And the first thing that happens is you're not sure where the data is. Or maybe it's on a spreadsheet that's hard to understand. These get in the way of the fundamental part of the conversation, which is how are we doing and where do we need to expend energy, resources, support to make improvement? So EPM is really about bringing that together and sorting it out, providing a hub by which we can have a conversation about what matters, namely how are we doing in terms of the services we're going to provide or the support within our organization. So lots of other definitions about EPM, but at its base level, that's what it is. There's a lot of benefits and outcomes. At the very top level, one of the biggest benefits of EPM is that it connects everybody. We know that we live in a world of transparency where information needs to be shared. And the more that we share it, the more that we're able to see it. In theory, the more we can get done. I'll talk about why that theory can be turned into practice a little bit. But in terms of the benefits of having a system like this, it starts right with being able to connect everybody. It allows us to have an alignment then of all the people and eventually the processes that allow us to get things done. But there are a lot of very specific advantages as well. For example, if we're looking to be able to ensure that the strategies we're developing have a place to actually land when they're done. So for example, if we're building a strategy around increased capacity or capability, then what happens when it's done, when that project's done? It's got to integrate into what we do every day. We call that fundamentals, and I'll explain that in a little bit. But the important thing about EPM is it allows us to actually anticipate that need and get in front of it ahead of time. It also allows us to focus on how are we going to be more efficient. Dollars are always precious. We want to make sure that those dollars are being used the very best way possible. And if we just throw them at everything we're trying to solve, we usually get nothing done. So the ability to prioritize and focus. Another very important aspect of it is the ability to actually increase employee engagement. We're going to talk about people, process, and technology a little bit. And a lot of times that gets outlined as people, process, and technology, as though they're all equal. They're not. In fact, it's people. Everything starts there. It's a pillar of how we get things done, and processes so that we know how we do it and what we do. And then technology is really in service to that. And we'll show you how that works with our results software later. But by actually keeping that in balance, one can have a significant increase in employee engagement, and nothing can be more powerful than having a highly engaged workforce. Well, there's a lot of other benefits as well. When we connect everybody, it actually allows conversations to happen that would normally not. So for example, when leadership sits and talks among leadership, that's great. But when leadership can actually talk to staff, field staff, for example, and be able to have a conversation not only about how's it going, but specifically looking at measures, looking at projects and saying, not only is how is it going, but how can I help? That's a very different, very powerful conversation. So those are the kinds of things that can happen when you have an EPM system to provide that information in one place. There's an ultimate benefit, and the ultimate benefit of all of this is going to be customer experience. All of us come to work with the goal of making sure that the customer experience and the outcomes for them are the best possible. And with an EPM system, that starts to become something that you can not only dramatically improve, but you can also measure more and more. Well, let's take a couple moments and actually talk about some very specific outcomes and benefits from having an EPM system. The data that you see here is a combination of looking at statistics over about 50 agencies over several years. We did that because we wanted to make sure that we could make some generalities that were based in fact, and that those facts were actually from agencies doing enterprise performance management. So let's start at the far left. In terms of employee engagement, it's been common to see increases literally from the surveys that are in the order of 45%, 40 to 50%, very significant uptick. Relative to getting up and running with EPM, that's always a challenge. You put a new system in, and sometimes we're used to that being something that we don't even get running for weeks and months. That's not the case with EPM. We'll show you how that works in just a little bit. But we can be up and running with results software, as an example, in less than 5 days. That's just huge, because it causes everybody to be excited and to be ready to get into the actual work of doing the work. It's important that there be value, literally, quickly. A lot of times when we install systems, we don't see the value of that for maybe a year or two. And that's sad, because number one, it's too long, and number two is we can lose interest, we can be discouraged. Value will come from an EPM system in 90 days or less. And in terms of the return on investment, we've been able to see return on investment of orders of 10 to 1. And what's really great about that is that if we're going to invest in a system that helps us do things better, we have to make sure that we can explain to everybody that that investment was returned with gain quickly. Otherwise, it's just another system that got added on to something else. And frankly, our stakeholders in general will not be impressed. Got to have a good ROI. Strategic initiatives are really a challenge. We have precious dollars to be able to spend on new projects. And oftentimes, it just doesn't go well. And there's nothing worse than having gotten halfway through a project only to discover that it's now going to take twice as long, 4 times the expense, et cetera, and then maybe be hard to integrate into the operations. Well, with EPM, you can get way ahead of that game. And frankly, it's very common to have the increase in success of initiatives be upwards of 25%, which is huge. We're always concerned with waste reduction and management of resources. And this is where EPM can give us the insights to be able to problem solve to dramatically reduce that, upwards of 75%. Well, how much training does it take, and how long does it take for me to get used to something and how to use it? is always a question. And with result software specifically, everybody can be trained somewhere between 60 and 90 days, depending on whether they're a user or an admin. And what's really cool about that is that it allows the agency to take control of the system right away and not to be dependent on trying to find information or having to go to endless classes just to get started. And then lastly, we always get asked, what about IT? There are not a lot of extra IT resources. So the good news is it only takes 1 to 2 days to really get the system stood up. And the reason for that is that all one has to do is get the security group in place, get the users into the security group, and it's ready to go. So it's very nice and fast and very low impact on IT. We're going to take a moment to talk about basically a management system. So if we stand back and say, well, what's at the heart of an enterprise performance management system? It's actually a system of management. Now, this is a very detailed drawing, and it's in the handout. I encourage you to download that because then you can study it in detail. But what it's basically illustrating is that a management system has to address several things simultaneously. One, it has to address what we do every day. The left-hand side of this chart actually is just meant to represent the operations. We have a very specific tool called Fundamentals that I'll talk about in a moment that helps get that organized into a very strong process view. On the right-hand side is the strategic initiatives. They might be called something else, but they really are where we spend our money to increase capacity and capability. And the two must come together somehow, or else we'll never be able to increase the ability to do what we do every day and improve it. So the system brings this all together through a Deming cycle. Now, what that means is that the heartbeat of the management system, the thing that's pulsing constantly, is plan, do, check, adjust. And you'll notice that at the bottom there, it says the roots of the system are in lean. That's true. And if you happen to be a lean organization, you'll recognize the entire system. It's just that the words are different. The words are just simply not Japanese words, but it is still the same system. However, what's really important to remember is that without the plan, do, check, adjust cycle going every time, it kind of loses the heartbeat. And then the currency of the system, the thing that makes it work, is that it's measures. And so throughout this system of looking at daily management and looking at strategy, we're always bringing measures and projects together, and we bring them together into a central resource, and that happens to be the result software. Traditionally, without a system like this, folks bring the information together in Excel, or they might bring it together in Smartsheets or something like that. And the problem with that is that you don't have a full system to manage with, and it ends up leading into some kind of chaos, and it doesn't connect everybody like the prior slides illustrated. So this system brings it all together nicely. And when you get a chance to download it and study the things that are on the left-hand side, you'll recognize the kind of activity necessary to make it work. This view is a different one. This one emphasizes that if we're going to install EPM, we have to recognize that it's part of a cultural transformation, whether we defined it or not. And all of us have experienced, especially the last 3 years, that our organizations are going through several transformations. One of them is how we manage. But one that goes along right with it is actually data. And you probably heard about establishing data culture and things like that. Well, what that all means is that we've got to move our way in which we manage from whatever traditional and probably manual way we had to a system that has a hub that brings the information together and allows us to stay customer focused and employee driven. Two tenets that are fundamental to any system, including, of course, a management system or a lean system. And so the important message here is that by focusing on this as a cultural transformation, we're going to focus on people first, process second, and then we're going to focus on how we use a system or technology to pull it together. Well, I said we talk a little bit about fundamentals because it's a core part of what we do to ensure that the operations is really understood well. So we'll talk a little bit about it at a high level, and then I'll show you a couple of examples of what they can look like. The fundamentals map, at its core, is a way of looking at the organization that is different from an org chart. We all know that an org chart will give us essentially a functional view, but a fundamentals map will give us a process view. And that process view will allow us to be able to answer very fundamental questions. What is it we do? And to be able to share that with people. How does it connect? Who are the customers? So let's go through that just briefly. At its top level are the basic strategy components that we have to have: a mission, vision, and core values. And almost every organization has that. But it's important to put that at the very top of this map, because it helps guide everything else we do. And we all know that mission, vision, and value, or core values, are something that is increasingly important to our workforce, because many people coming into the workforce today, the first thing they look at is what is the vision and what's the mission, and why should I care about it? So very important stuff that we do take serious. Well, secondly, is we've got to have an ability to know what is it we want to accomplish to define success. They're called key goals. There are lots of other ways that they are described, but key goals is a simple way to think of what are the enduring things that we have to make sure that we accomplish in order to be successful in the delivery of our mission. Then comes a heavy lift that's very important, and that's defining the core processes. So core processes are essentially, what is it we do that, when all is said and done, delivers the services that we said we would? And so think of it this way: there are two kinds of core processes. There's the operating ones, and so those are going to be processes such as determining eligibility, or delivering products and services, things like that. And then there's supporting processes. Those are things like IT, HR, finance, and all of them are extremely important in order to get the whole organization working. So the core processes then represent how we describe what we do, not only to ourselves, but to everybody else that we interact with. And I'm going to show you an example here of what it looks like. You can't read this, of course, but when you download it, you can study it. This is the fundamentals map. And the taxonomy of this is exactly what you saw in the diagram earlier. At the very top are the foundational elements of vision, mission, values. The very next thing down is the goals. And that's what we have to always keep in mind. We've got to meet those goals. If we're not, then something's fundamentally wrong. The very next section are the core processes themselves. And as you can see, they're lined up, and the chevrons kind of indicate a left to right motion. That's typical. And basically, they speak to the things that we have to do every day to ensure that we're delivering on what our promises are. Well, the next part is very important. What are the measures that we're going to use to determine if we're doing it right? Let's pause for a moment. There are two kinds of measures: process measures and outcome measures. Process measures are what we're talking about here, and they're the indicators that the process is running. So in other words, they're actually leading indicators. They can tell us what's going to happen tomorrow or the next day, as opposed to looking back and saying, well, let me in review tell you what's going on. So process measures are extremely important. They're almost always focused on things like quality, time, etc. And so they're key to the whole thing. Ownership of measures is critical. In an organization, sometimes the org chart is used to define who owns what. And while that can work to a certain extent, it doesn't work in a process view, because in fact, we're working across the organization. So ownership for processes is identified, and often at the highest level, because that way the owner can take responsibility for supporting the process. Of course, there's a full team that's working on it, lots of people involved. But what does that owner do? The owner is the person that stays in touch with the process, with the teams, and ensures that the right resources are there, that problem solving is being added, etc. Well, then comes outcome measures. And outcome measures are really how we decide that we're achieving our goals. So outcome measures are the kinds of things that are typically, we look backwards at. How are we doing in terms of employee engagement? What about on-time performance? Those kinds of things. They're very critical, and they too have owners. And so the entire system, when you hook it together, allows you to basically have a clear definition of what you do, who's responsible, how you measure it, or in other words, how you're going to explain to your stakeholders how things are going, or why, for example, you need more money, etc. Well, we have to pause and talk about data, because implied in this entire system is the need for data. Most of us are experiencing sort of a deluge of data. It's happening, of course, in business, but it happens in our personal life too. And so data has become something that all of us deal with. And so in the professional world, the problem is this. There's a wide variety of maturity levels for data. And often we find ourselves in the far left of this grid, which means that we're using data very ad hoc. We're probably being reactive. We're probably looking backwards more than forwards. And while that's better than nothing, it's really just the beginning. So one of the goals of having EPM is to actually mature and move along this path. It's a journey, and it takes a long time because you're moving an entire organization. The far right, yes, it's highly optimized. It's also potentially nirvana in that it can be a real challenge to get there, and one doesn't have to be there to do a really good job of running their enterprise performance management. Because as soon as you start moving from the far left into, say, intuition, you're already off to a good start because you're defining KPIs. You're starting to use a system to be able to actually use data to determine what decisions you're going to make. So anyway, as we move forward, you'll see that the data maturity does play an important role in the whole thing. Well, let's take a moment to talk about the technology. We purposely put the technology at the end of the discussion of people and process and tech because, as we said earlier, the technology is really here to serve. This is a view of results software technology stack. If we start at the bottom layer, it's built upon the Microsoft Azure cloud. Now, that's a decision that was made consciously based upon basically state agencies and how common they are in Microsoft shop, and also a decision that was made relative to Amazon, AWS, and Google. And we landed on Microsoft because we liked it as a developer and our customers like it. So the very first layer is that cloud, which provides an enormously powerful place to build an application like this. The next layer is the data sources. So results software will connect to any reasonable data source that's out there. It may be project management, case management, HRIS. It doesn't matter as long as an output can be extracted from it, or it's pushing output into a data lake or whatever, and we'll connect to that, which means that there's a secure API, application programming interface. That secure layer allows us then to take the data from wherever it's available and then securely move it into the next layer up. I always talk about the database and the application pretty much together. We call it the command center, but what that means is the heavy lift of the application is happening there. What that contains is things like, well, that's where all the data is connected. That's where all the projects are being managed. That's where all of the ownership is being handled. Well, what that looks like, of course, when you look under the hood, is a giant application that is doing the job of gluing things together that was before using a product like this, was being done with spreadsheets. Very awkward, not going to happen. So the command center is extremely powerful, but most users never look at it. What most users look at is the presentation layer. The presentation layer is where the dashboards are. And that's where people get to see what's going on quickly and easily. It doesn't matter if it's an executive review or a daily huddle. Dashboards provide us with the visibility into how are we doing from a KPI point of view? How are we doing in terms of our projects? An important thing to distinguish here is that oftentimes EPM is represented by the presentation layer. So in other words, we talk to each other about what we see. But if we're going to be installing a system like this, we have to recognize that it's a little bit like an iceberg. You know, the top 10% or whatever of the iceberg is above the water, but what's below it is extremely important, because without it, well, I guess you'd have no iceberg, and you certainly would have no EPM. So what that means is that while we're looking at the presentation layer, which might be done in Power BI or Tableau or any other tool, in reality, what hooks it together, what brings all the people together, as that prior diagram showed, what allows us to get the engagement high because we've connected folks and they have data, is all happening because of the command center sitting on top of the data sources, sitting on top of a robust system that's the bottom line platform. So this is an important concept just because it helps us understand why investing in the system is not just investing in the pretty pictures, the dashboards, it's investing in a way to connect everybody. The next two slides also are a lot of detail, and you'll be able to look at it when you download. But what we wanted to share with you is that there really is a way to describe the journey. So when we said we would talk about this journey and of how to do EPM, this is actually a picture of it. And what it's basically saying is that there's swim lanes that, from a sponsor's point of view, you can follow and actually make this all happen. And notice that this is on a timeline of, it says July to December. It just gives a sense of what might happen over a 3 months and then a following 3 months period. And if we look at the swim lanes, the first one is basically operations and strategy, getting it defined. So in the case of the operations, it's putting a fundamentals in place. In the case of the strategy, it's putting all the strategy in place and then housing it, of course, along with the fundamentals in the technology. Well, then that leads to, okay, so if we've got it all in there, the next lane is, okay, let's put some dashboards together. And what's cool about that is you don't have to just put together something that everybody else did. Every organization has different needs. So why not put together dashboards that represent the best way to look at KPIs and projects for a particular agency? And that's actually very fun because it allows the user who's going to be looking at this to feel like they're seeing themselves, not somebody else, through a general purpose tool. Obviously, you need to develop KPIs. That's an ongoing process. There's lots and lots of gap analysis. So the third swim lane is important. And the next one down is about sponsorship and change management. This entire system is predicated on being able to have very powerful sponsorship, and that starts at the leadership level, but really it's sponsorship at all levels. So for example, a process owner is going to be sponsoring that work for that process. And equally important is change management. Without change management, what happens is the system starts to just run amok. People basically say, why am I doing it? And the answer to the question is not, nobody gives an answer. And without that why, it just simply will start to stall. So investing in change management, very important. And then business reviews is the last one I wanted to mention. Being able to review on various cycles is important. So there may be quarterly business reviews. They're great for looking backwards and saying, how are we doing? Monthly business reviews are something we are very prescriptive about because it's a chance to basically look not only backwards, but also forwards. What are we going to do next month? And then weekly team meetings and literally daily huddles are equally important. And all of them can be managed from a system like this in real time and without having to run around and ask, well, who's got the data? Where is it? In other words, eliminate the chaos, eliminate the noise. Well, let's spend a few minutes talking about some success stories. There's many of them. We've chosen two from two different kinds of domains, one from Human Services, which happens to be the Washington Department of Vocational Rehab, DVR, and the other one is from the Department of Corrections. And I'm just going to share with you some of the things that we've noticed in our work with these agencies, and then I'll generalize some of that in some examples after that. So the story at DVR is exciting. Basically, if you're not familiar with vocational rehab, what they do, my simple way of explaining it is that they are changing the lives of people who need help going, let's face it, for example, coming out of high school, and they need to have either further education or a job or whatever they choose to do, and DVR helps them do that in ways that otherwise don't happen. It's something that I personally am just in awe of, because that kind of work is so complicated and yet it's done every day. What's been a real honor for us, though, is that we've been able to be part of it by bringing a management system to play. So DVR made the decision that they were going to change the way in which they manage and use data more frequently, to use data actually continuously, and to bring together both the day-to-day operations and the strategy into one system. They've actually done that. They're about a year into this process and are already managing now by having transparent data available to the entire organization. I'll show you a couple of examples of the sort of dashboards in a moment, but what's exciting is that this kind of work and the work that we do with other human service organizations is so mission driven. One of the cool things about being if you will, a vendor or a supplier of EPM into human services is it's an opportunity to see and learn how the real world works in terms of providing services to not only folks who want vocational rehab, but also to aging or child welfare, etc. And it's phenomenal. And so for us, it's been great to be able to see the ability to have EPM, which is a process and technology, come and play a role in this world. In a completely different vein, I'll tell you a little bit about Arizona Corrections. Several years ago, Arizona made a decision to put a management system in place for the entire state. Governor Ducey actually came to us and said, well, we'd like to use your management system. And so we did. We installed it. And what that meant was the stuff that you saw in the diagram of the system was installed. And then furthermore, it started to be used. And Corrections, which is one of the largest organizations in Arizona, made the decision to implement the management system all the way down into the staff level or the CO2 level. And so after several years, here's what they're doing. Number one is they use the management system as a way of actually managing the operations. Data is a very big deal for them. They have lots of data, and they've done a great job of being able to get it to the point where they can quickly review it. For example, they can quickly review it and say, well, how are we doing on inmate programs for education? How are we doing in terms of assault? And be able to have a conversation quickly to decide, okay, where do we need to apply our problem-solving resources? It's been very exciting to see, and when you download the deck, there's a link to a video from a CO2 who, in her own words, will tell you what it's like to take a management system and then on the front line apply problem solving to the things that happen every day. Very exciting. Well, I'm going to show you some sample dashboards just to kind of give you a feel for the kinds of things that are being done. In the deck that you download, there's static images, but what I'll do is switch over to a different screen, and what I'd like to do is actually just show you a few examples of what agencies are doing with an EPM system once they have the data in the system and they begin to imagine the possibilities for how to look at it. The first example I'm going to give you happens to be from the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. They're working on a lot of things, but there are 5 strategic initiatives that are very, very important. And it has to do with, as you can see, mule deer and wolf and several other things that if you're familiar with Fish and Wildlife, you'll recognize these as critical issues. In particular, they wanted to be able to take these initiatives and be able to, at a glance, be able to say, how am I doing? And so what we put together for them was this particular spotlight. And right now, the sage grouse is live, so to speak. Odd Freudian there. But the sage grouse is live. And if I click on sage grouse, the first thing that happens is that I actually get the entire story of this particular initiative. So what's great about this is when this gets displayed, for example, in front of people who are, say, on a commission who can't quite remember what was the original plan, here it is on one page. And it includes the description, the goals, the objectives, and of course the strategies. And it's the strategies that are now coming to life. So for example, if I go forward one more time, so I'm just clicking the right arrow, if I do, I end up getting a view that says, well, this particular initiative has got 6 strategies. And at a glance, I can tell how we're doing. So, strategy number 2, which happens to be about reviews, looks like it's about 35% complete. Great. And then if I look at strategy number 6, which is basically final approval, well, of course, that one is got a lot of time left, and it's about 10%. So at a glance, I can really answer the question, where are we? Of course, I'm going to want detail. So if we click on the icon that is below these, I'll just pick one arbitrarily, S4, strategy 4. Then I get a Gantt chart. And the Gantt chart, this one has basically 3 major tasks. And as the tasks get added to it, they'll all just automatically show up here. And so what's very nice about this is that I can be sitting, doing a high-level review, answer the question, how are we doing by the spotlight, and quickly jump to the actual schedule itself. I'll go back here now. And so imagine this. If I have this quick glance at how we're doing, I've answered the question that is on everybody's mind. Are we okay or not? But the very next question, of course, is, well, are we measuring something? And so as these programs start to develop basically outcome measures and process measures, then those dashboards will be added to it so that you can just quickly get to it. Let me contrast that briefly with how things work when you don't have a system. You sit down for a meeting like this. Somebody has some spreadsheets. Somebody has some charts. Somebody else probably has output from, say, Microsoft Project. And none of it is in one place, but it's all there more or less. The way the conversation goes is not crisp and snappy. It's jumping between things, and they're not quite formatted right, and the charts don't quite tell you what you want. And the problem with all that is you spend up an enormous amount of energy talking about the tools. We don't want to do that. We want to talk about the actual content. And so what's beautiful about a simple system like this is it allows a layering approach to getting into the conversation. Well, let's take a look at a whole different view. So this happens to be a view where heat maps and projects are brought together. Now, I should show you, by backing up for a moment, that this particular view happens to be from California's Department of Motor Vehicles, DMV. And what's exciting is that they made the decision to bring KPIs, or key performance indicators, and their strategic portfolio together, so it was in one place when they review it with the council. And so I'm going to show you bits and pieces of that. Let's start with what they chose to do with their KPI. So I'll click on that left-hand box again. And when I do, I get a heat map. And what the heat map is telling me is that for these 10 measures, which were purposely selected, I not only know their values, but I know where they are on the red, green, yellow targeting system or threshold system. And so at a glance, I know that I probably don't want to talk or don't need to talk about wait time because it looks pretty good, but customer stats not so good, transaction time down here on the lower left. And if I say I'm concerned, why don't I just click on that? I did. And when I click on that, I get the detail. Now imagine doing that without a system that had all the stuff under the water line that I showed you, connecting the data so that we could go above the water line and with one click get to the information. And what's invaluable about this is we're now looking at the trend, as you can see, going back to 2020, and it allows a simple conversation over, well, how are we doing and how are we doing compared to the prior period, and on and on. Plus, there's a lot of other really good things here. For example, maybe we can't quite remember what the calculation was for this. So if I click on the calculation button, it pops it up and tells me. These are the sort of value-added capability that an EPM tool brings to the table. And instead of having to worry about the tool and worry about the data, I can worry about the question. And that's very powerful. Well, let's bounce back up again. We're going to do that by just going backwards. And we're going to jump over to the enterprise side of things. We'll start with goal comparison. And what's exciting about this is that DMV decided to do what many agencies have, which is to take their strategic initiatives and what they're generally what they're doing and put it into buckets. And in this case, 5 buckets: workforce, digital services, etc. And of course, these buckets can be whatever is appropriate. And this is at a glance how is the portfolio looking relative to those buckets? And so, for example, if we look over in customers, we say, well, we've got 3 projects that are green, that's great, but yeah, 3 yellows and 1 red, so that's problematic. And of course, if I click on the red one, then I'll quickly reduce everything down so I can see which ones were red and then go back up again. So what's nice about this is at the highest level, I can have a conversation about where are we without having to scramble for it. I can also do something else. I can sort it by sponsor. And this gets to be really exciting because sometimes when you're in a meeting, you have to focus on one area. Maybe it's the IT sponsor, maybe it's somebody else. And so all of that becomes easy to do so that the conversations are enabled. But let's go backwards and take a look at a couple of different views. Let's look at the overall health. This is really exciting. There are a lot of projects running simultaneous. In fact, it looks like there's about 30 right now. You can see that the trend has been up and down. That's a lot of strategic projects. And this particular dashboard provides the ability to see at a glance the trends across all projects over time. And what's invaluable about that is that you're able to go, well, it looks like we're kind of holding steady on the yellows. They're not getting too many more. Same thing with reds, versus what if the picture said the reds are getting bigger all the time? That'd be a problem. So that's really nice at a glance. And then the table below gives us a heat map view of every project. So they're all over here. We scroll through them. And when we scroll through them, we can actually then see, well, how are we doing relative to some standard measures? Budget, overall health, schedule, scope, and staff. And this heat map just gives us an at-a-glance view of how we're doing. And so let's just say that we want to look at one. I'm just going to be arbitrary and pick this one here, customer and business partners. And now I want to see the detail. So all I have to do is go click on the project summary. And what comes up is exactly that. So in 2 clicks, we went from the highest level view, literally the heat map, down to a fairly low level where we can now actually examine this particular project from the following point of view. We can look at the milestones, that's up above. We can look at the health and notice that in overall health, these comments, the status is all here. This is invaluable. To be able to actually see what people have to say about the project over time and not lose that or have to hunt for it makes a huge difference. For example, oftentimes, whoever's in charge of the project moves on. And when they do, all that history is still here. Furthermore, at a glance, I can see, well, there's something wrong with overall health. Maybe it's schedule. Let's look at schedule. No, it's fine. And I could go through here until I found what the problem was. Why would I do that? To have a conversation about what to do about it, to decide whether we're going to address it, let's say with staff, and then, okay, what problem solving are we going to apply? So basically in 2 clicks, we can go from the highest level, we can go instantly down to having a conversation about what to do about this. I've got time to show you a couple more, so let me just jump in here and see which ones I want to do. I want to show you something that comes out of the private sector, but it's a fascinating way to look at data, and it's starting to be applied now with most of our customers in the public sector. And it's a use of a balanced scorecard. This happens to be now from a commercial example, so that's why you see a lot of things that look like private sector. But here's the problem to solve. This is a lot of measures that have to be looked at, not only at the highest level, but at every level of down into the field. And in order to do that, it needed to be sorted and sifted. So a balanced scorecard was used. Now, for those of you who use balanced scorecard, it's typically divided into 4 quadrants, and they're financial and people and operations and customer. That's very typical. But what's nice about it is that it allows us then to take a conversation around 15 or 20 measures and size it down. And so now if I want to talk about people, I can just go over to this people quadrant. And if I click on one of these, then I get rather rapidly a nice view of how is it going for these measures, and they're all related. So in other words, I really want to know the relationship between days to hire and turnover as the example. and it's nice to have the employee satisfaction there. And furthermore, because maybe I'm actually at the executive level and I don't want to look at every month, I go up and click on the quarterly button and reduce it to quarters instantly. And furthermore, I'll put it back to monthly. And maybe I don't want to just look at the last 12 months. Maybe I'd like to look at the last 18, so I'll change it to 18 and instantly be able to do that. So the point of this is I can quickly move from a top-level view to suddenly looking at the details of a operation and be able to drill into it, adjust the time, etc. Well, let me go back to my slides. And I wanted to allow time for questions. So Tim, I think what we should do is switch to our questions and go from there.
Okay, great. The first one that I have is results software ADA compliant and accessible for visually impaired individuals?
Great question, thank you. Yes, the short answer is yes, it is. And I'd like to take a moment to describe that a little bit. Most software applications and most software vendors will say yes to that question. However, when you explore it, when you put, for example, a JAWS reader onto it, sometimes the answer is, yeah, it's accessible, but awkward. We've made a decision to not do that. We've worked on accessibility for quite a long time. And so the way we've approached it is this. First of all, the command center is accessible. It's easy to navigate from the home page to the dashboards, for example. But when you get into dashboards, dashboards are built for visual people. Allow me to just take a moment. I'm just going to scan forward here so I find something. I'll take this one. So this dashboard is built for obviously a sighted person. And if you just turn it into something that reads, it actually doesn't do a very good job. It's chaos. So what we do is actually custom code the accessible dashboards so that they provide the information necessary for those who are not sighted without the noise that this dashboard would have if you just put JAWS on it and started reading. So specifically, we could create a version of the dashboard that says, welcome to the dashboard, really says what it is, describes briefly what it is, and then says the measure name, the measure target, the measure value, and the actual color of the threshold very explicitly, and then moves on with the simple tabbing through it. So the short answer is yes, and the long answer is, and we keep applying that kind of capability over and over and over again to these highly visual dashboards that are need to be converted.
Okay, the next two that I have are related. What is the setup, implementation, and training of results software like in terms of time and resource bandwidth? And does setting up the results software include a lot of work with our IT department?
Okay, good that you put them together. Thanks, Tim. So let me just describe the activities and then put a timeline on it. So once the purchase is made of results software, the purchase is actually for a SaaS product. So it's by definition SaaS. It's also by definition not on-prem, so it's in the cloud, and it's running, of course, on the Microsoft Cloud. So the very first thing that happens is we just have to decide to put together a security group, because without the security group, there's no way to proceed forward. So that has to happen, and then the users have to be put in there. So the actual first act of getting going is very short. It's literally done in 1 or 2 days, and it's done. Then, of course, it's time to basically do some basic training. The training is divided up into typically 3 parts: administrative, power user, and user. The administrative training takes literally 90 minutes. There's always ongoing support. We can talk about that later. But in 90 minutes, an administrator is up and running, and an administrator of results software has the ability to control virtually everything without having to write tickets to request help, which is very, very powerful. User training is done typically in about 60 minutes, and then there's lots and lots of online help and help center to be able to supplement that. So those are the activities that happen. In terms of elapsed time, we find that once the decision is made to proceed, within 2 weeks, everything in elapsed time, everything is up and running, and people are getting into the system, entering data, and actually beginning to have their first dashboards come to life.
Okay. Next, what if we do not have any performance measures already?
Interesting question. That's okay. Many organizations might have a few measures, might have no measures, might have qualitative measures. And that's okay, because the very first thing we can do is take what you have, if there is anything, and put that in there so that we start creating a story around it. The actual act of developing measures is easy to do when you start with the fundamentals. So if we start building out the fundamental story, and it doesn't have to be total, we just get started, then it won't take long to have a conversation around, well, what are the outcome measures that matter, that are going to support the key goals? And right there, all of a sudden, somewhere 3 to 5 measures that are critical have been defined. So if you don't have measures already, it's okay. Get started. That's the whole point.
Next question is, we've run into some resistance in the past. Our team may not be open to being measured. How do you address that situation?
Well, it's more common than it's not, and there are many reasons for it. So the first step is to understand what is really at the heart of the resistance. So for example, if the resistance is because it's being used as a weapon, then clearly there's some work to be done in terms of working with the sponsor executives to change that culturally, because the system is not going to address that. That's a change management and a leadership issue. So that we're happy to help with that. We do a lot of consulting there. But it may turn out that it's really not that at all. It may just be a fear of using it, lack of experience. And that's what training and education and frankly, good application of change management to ensure that we start down the journey, if you will, of learning to use data. That's where that comes into play. So in other words, it really depends upon what is the exact reason for the resistance, as opposed to no peanut butter solution on that. And then it can be addressed. And we found, generally speaking, an organization can move forward once they understand what it is that was the rock that was in the place in the first place.
More. First is, can I use the software without any consulting services?
Yes. The answer to can you use it without consulting services is yes. Once it's installed, once you've had basic training, really you can just proceed on your own. We'll ensure that we give you the guidance initially so that you know where to start. We'll also make sure that you have access to the Learning Center, and we have an AI bot that'll provide all kinds of reference material so that you can proceed on your own.
Okay, and to wrap it up, can I have you present to my team?
Absolutely. If you have a team that's ready to learn more, and no matter what stage they're at, reach out to us. We'll put together a session so that we can present to them. And frankly, unlike this, we'll do it where we're all live so that we can answer questions and interact and that kind of thing. Love to do that, so just let us know.
Okay, great. I think that is everything from my end.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. I hope that what we've done is clarify a little bit around how you can get started with EPM. In essence, it's a journey, and it's not a scary journey. It's a great journey, and all one has to do is make the decision to start. It will unfold, as outlined today, on its own in a natural and a pretty fast way. Thank you for joining.